I was posted to the German Air Force, which included the Richthofen-Staffel squadron of the so-called Red Baron. Here the atmosphere was completely different to the rather stuffy one at the mental hospital. There were men of my own age, and these were men who knew that they had to act on their own initiative to succeed in mortal combat with enemy airmen. With these knights of the air, one could still detect the age-old code of chivalry. The men belonged to a force which had not existed in former wars, and they were masters of their own destinies. Of course, they were given orders and directives, but once airborne they were single fighting units and had to rely on their own ability, alertness and courage as combat pilots. A sort of code of honour existed between the German and British flyers which both sides respected. It was not the done thing to kick a man when he was down, metaphorically speaking. Once the victor had made sure that his adversary was beaten, he left him alone. Not so the French airmen, who would machine gun a crashed aeroplane to kill the pilot and his observer. This gentleman's agreement had grown up between the British and German air forces. They fired because they were being fired at, and they killed so as not to be killed, and of course because they were ordered to do so. It often happened that a British airman who had been shot down over German territory would be invited to the officers' mess and toasted as an honoured foe. Wreaths would be dropped for an air ace killed in combat, or the personal effects of a downed German or British pilot would float down over the airfield where he had been stationed. I mingled with the mighty, including those who wore the highest German decoration for valour, the Pour le Mérite, also known as the Blue Max. As well as Manfred von Richthofen himself, one of these was a certain Captain Hermann Göring. Quite a number of the flyers confided in me that before each mission they were overcome by a terrible fear of death, which they had great difficulty in hiding. They would often sit trembling in the cockpit of their aircraft before takeoff, but once in the air this nervous tension disappeared, and most of them would take on an icy calm. All the same, I had to recommend that some of them be grounded due to their state of extreme nervous exhaustion. I had many arguments with the chaplain. He would insist on blessing the fighter aircraft, bristling with machine guns, before they went up for the kill. I never did understand where religion fits in at, say, the launching of an atomic submarine designed to destroy hundreds of thousands of human beings. Surely this is not in keeping with the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill"? The chaplain answered that the German airmen were fighting for their fatherland, for freedom and for a better world. Yet from my perspective, the problem was that the British, French and all the other nations involved in this bloody war were all doubtless fighting for the same ideals. Hatred did not exist between combatants. It was something manufactured by the politicians and bellicose propagandists far behind the lines of battle. Even some of the most recently published accounts of the Great War repeat the distorted fictions that the 1914 to 1918 propaganda machines were able to pass off as fact. When weather conditions prevented any flying, we played cards for ridiculously high stakes, which nobody had the slightest intention of paying. Then followed philosophical discussions, mainly on courage and death. We all agreed that only people devoid of imagination were the so-called fearless ones, because they were incapable of picturing what might lie in store for them. In flying conditions, we would hear machine gun fire from high above us in the sky, and looking up, would see 2 or more planes dogfighting. They twisted and jinked around each other, climbed and dived, and by turns were both pursuer or pursued. Suddenly one would catch fire. Emitting smoke, it would break up in the air and flutter down like a dead leaf, as 1 or 2 tiny spots plunged down towards the earth. The crew. In those days there were no parachutes or ejector seats. When they hit the ground, the bodies would bury themselves into the earth, sometimes several feet deep into the soft, mashed-up earth. The medical journals published long articles by experts claiming that the rapid fall through the air caused the aorta to rupture, resulting in instant death. However, at several post-mortems which I had to attend, it was found that this was not the case. The new sport of freefall parachuting proves the point. No, these poor chaps lived until they hit the ground. With the traditional grim humour of such situations, the joke that did the rounds was that specially made coffins were provided for them, very broad and very flat. One of the units I had to look after was for long-range reconnaissance. They often flew over London in broad daylight, and I saw photographs of the Thames, Tower Bridge and Buckingham Palace, taken from a height of more than 19,000 feet. The aircraft were open to the elements and seemed to comprise wooden struts held together by piano wire. The sides of the fuselages of these orange boxes were lengths of canvas painted grey and bearing the Iron Cross. In front sat the pilot with the single engine forward of him, whilst the observer sat behind him on a small folding stool to which he was loosely tied by a safety belt, though he was otherwise unsecured. A pistol for very lights was the only firearm carried. When one of the pilots invited me to go up with him in his little kite, I did not take him seriously, especially as he told me he had very nearly crashed the day before. When he pressed me on the matter, I relented, not realizing that he meant that we should fly that very minute, and so I could not avoid it without serious loss of face. Goggles, crash helmet, fur-lined jacket and gloves were ready for me. Disconcertingly, before I climbed aboard, an orderly wrote down the names and addresses of my next of kin, just in case. To add to my feelings of foreboding, another airman told me that a lone enemy fighter could easily swoop out of cloud to dispatch a slow-flying reconnaissance machine. In some trepidation, then, I was strapped in. The pilot fired up the engine and the aeroplane slowly rose into the air. Once airborne, the pilot pulled all kinds of stunts, twists, stall turns, chandelles, dives and steep climbs, so that I became completely disorientated. When at last we landed on terra firma, I thanked my lucky stars for the safe return. However, with this initiation behind me, I flew again, but without the aerobatics. As I enjoyed it, I went on to take part in quite a number of training flights. About a quarter of a mile from the township where the Air Group HQ was situated, there was a prisoner of war camp. I had to attend its inmates, and here I found a mixed bag of nationalities with British, French, Italian, Romanian, Indian, Portuguese and Russian prisoners. In this Tower of Babel, it needed a linguistic genius to understand the patients and to make them understand what they had to do. Bolit, it hurts, and kashel, cough, were the only Russian words I had mastered, so I resorted to the international language, namely speaking with my hands. Terrible undernourishment was the cause of many of their ailments. The emaciated bodies, with hunger, edema, and deeply sunken eyes, were an awful sight. The prisoners suffered from all kinds of sores, and I did all I could for them with the very limited means at my disposal. It was pitiful to see the Russian prisoners, with their swollen and bleeding feet wrapped in rags, searching the rubbish bins for something to eat. After all, what could the hungry German soldiers have left on their own plates? The British and French, on the other hand, looked well nourished. They received regular food parcels from the Red Cross, and some even offered food to their German guards. I suggested to the camp commandant that we should pool the food parcels and share their contents out equally between all the prisoners. This he did. The Russians beamed, and some of the British and French grumbled. For them, apparently, when it came to food, the entente cordiale was in short supply. As the only French doctor in the little local town had died, I inherited his civilian patients. I always carried a small pocketbook, which proved most helpful in finding the right diagnosis and treatment. I now had to deal with heart and skin troubles as well as gynecological ones. Even my vade-mecum failed me quite often, and I went to consult the French pharmacist on the pretext that the proprietary names of his drugs were unfamiliar to me. In comparison to me, the midwife proved a veritable font of knowledge. One night I was called by her to a woman in childbirth, and Madame la Sage-Femme decided that I would have to use forceps. Finding a pair of obstetric forceps among the instruments of a flying corps doctor was a little too much to ask, so we searched the house of the deceased doctor, where we finally discovered some rather antiquated forceps. Before joining the army, I had had some training at university in how to use these instruments. We had to try them out on the heads of dead babies which were inserted from above into an exact replica of a female pelvis lined with leather. We called these models leather virgins, so in the middle of the night I tried my luck and delivered a young Frenchman. Under the circumstances, I could not reveal that I was only a medical student in the uniform of a medical officer, as this would have undermined the confidence of all those concerned. Of course, I never accepted any fees for my rather inadequate services. However, the French civilians were so well supplied with rice, cocoa and coffee by the Red Cross organization that they brought me a whole 100-weight of rice. I immediately sent this in small parcels to my starving family in Berlin. Furthermore, we bartered food. What could a French woman do with cocoa but no sugar? So 2 pounds of artificial honey were exchanged for half a pound of cocoa, and this also went to Berlin, where it was swapped again, perhaps for some butter. I heard that my mother and some of her friends went on extended tours to the countryside, where benevolent farmers sold them meat or eggs at tremendously inflated prices. When they arrived back in Berlin, policemen stood ready to relieve them of their heavy loads, and on top of the loss of their precious hauls, they were fined for infringing emergency regulations. After the war, the Regius Professor of Hygiene admitted that the urban population of Germany would have perished without the black market. Early one afternoon, I received an urgent call to a pilot officer. The man was running a high temperature and was on the verge of delirium, so that I was almost afraid to examine him. The only thing for me to do was to have him taken at once to a military hospital, where I knew that a medical specialist would be available. I accompanied him and attended the examination, but the physician was as much at sea as I was with regard to diagnosing his condition. He referred to his books again, as I had done, but this proved fruitless. He asked me to wait. 3 hours later, the empty hospital was overrun with similar cases, as Spanish influenza had invaded Europe and many other parts of the world. This was to prove a vital influence on the war. Whole army corps would actually be halved in number. Our own squadrons could not send up any reconnaissance planes, because between 50 and 60% of the pilots, observers and ground crew were laid up. We were unaware of the fact that the same plague had attacked the enemy lines, necessitating a halt in America's recruiting for the US Army and forcing their training camps to close down. It was mostly lung complications which made the mortality rates so high, and most of the victims, it claimed, had previously been among the strongest and healthiest. Doctors and nurses were not immune. I developed a high temperature, severe headache, and had difficulty breathing. 6 aspirin and half a bottle of brandy helped me to recover. Unscientific and unorthodox, certainly, but it worked. After all, this pestilence had never before been mentioned in medical publications. It had descended upon an ignorant medical profession which did not possess the means of detecting the germs or bacilli which caused it. We did not have electron microscopes, nor did we know anything about sulfur drugs or antibiotics. The Spanish flu ranged far and wide. It affected the whole world and accounted for the deaths of more people than Mars, god of war. Field hospitals for all the front lines were concentrated in France, and I was posted to one of them. The hospital unit had come from Romania, where all except 2 of the doctors and all but 6 of the orderlies had died of spotted fever. Medical officers had become so scarce that they were moved about as stopgaps to wherever they were needed most. The German universities were producing hardly any young doctors because schoolboys were drafted into the armed forces as soon as they reached 18. My new hospital was established in goods sheds near to a small railway station. When I was on duty one night, the station master summoned me urgently to an accident which called for both surgery and psychiatry. A group of mostly elderly soldiers had been standing on the platform waiting for a train to Germany, either on leave or because they had been posted to factories or other formations. When the train arrived, a very athletic-looking sergeant got out and, with absolutely no warning, produced a knife and stabbed one of the old soldiers in the neck, just where the carotid artery runs. Blood gushed out and the man collapsed. As he was about to run completely amok, the sergeant was overpowered, knocked out and tied up by the other soldiers. When I arrived, the only thing I could do was to bind the nasty-looking wound with a field dressing and to press my finger down hard on it. I continued to apply pressure to the wound as the man was carried away on a stretcher to the operating theatre. The surgeon operated immediately and found that by sheer luck the dagger blade had only split but not severed the almost finger-thick artery, so he was able to sew it up with very thin threads inserted so close to each other that they almost touched. The sergeant was taken to a mental hospital. I later heard that he eventually landed up in the same place in the Ardennes, where I had been on duty a few weeks earlier. On another occasion, a soldier reported that he had swallowed a bone which had stuck in his gullet, causing great difficulty in breathing. The MO on duty tried to get hold of the bone and extract it with a special instrument known as a coin catcher. This was a metal contraption fixed to the top of a long whalebone. When introduced into the esophagus, this was supposed to catch hold of the foreign body by means of a swivelling movement and to draw it out. The doctor duly introduced this crude apparatus, but when he tried to pull it back out, the instrument itself would not budge. The patient complained of sharp pains, began to toss about, and bleeding set in. He was X-rayed, and we could see the metal top sticking up from just behind his heart. None of us knew what to do, and the surgeon resorted to his textbooks on invasive surgery. He could not decide from which end to approach, from below through the stomach or from above via the thoracic cavity. However, he lacked the necessary experience and appropriate instruments for the latter method. Anesthetic masks and Sauerbruch's hyperpressure chambers had yet to be invented, and techniques which enabled the lungs to remain extended even after the pleural cavity had been opened, and operations performed on the intrathoracic organs were unknown at that time. In the meantime, the poor patient was lying there with the long handle of an instrument sticking out of his mouth, whilst he was bleeding and turning blue in the face. After long and rather agitated discussions all round, someone had a brainwave. Amongst our instruments we had another flexible whalebone, which had a small sponge attached to its end. We soaked the sponge in water and carefully introduced it so that it came to rest on top of the coin catcher. It covered it so as to clear the way upward, and so it was withdrawn, painstakingly slowly, together with the metal contraption. The bone which the soldier said he had swallowed had never existed. He had suffered a nervous spasm of the gullet and the windpipe. In the meantime, the fighting between the British and the Germans had virtually come to a standstill, so we admitted hardly any frontline casualties. The Germans bolstered their defensive positions, and the British only attacked sporadically. However, some French and British politicians who had never been near the front line themselves made dramatic demands of their war-weary troops to go on fighting to throw the Germans back. Some British units were forced to heed these instructions, went over the top and suffered completely unnecessary losses as a result. For many years I have read the Times personal columns of births, marriages and deaths. I am too old now to be interested in births or even marriages. I leave this to my grandchildren, who have almost grown up themselves. I do, however, read the deaths columns with close attention, because now and then I find the familiar name of an old pal who has joined the great army above. The names of officers and men who sacrificed their lives on the many battlefronts where the British fought can be found in another column, headed in memoriam. The place names such as Festubert, Loos, Beaumont, Cambrai or Ypres include those where I fought or served as a surgeon. A few weeks ago I found the name of a lieutenant colonel from the Irish Guards. He was a winner of the Victoria Cross, Military Cross and Bar, an officier et chevalier de l'Ordre de Léopold, Croix de Guerre, Belge, Légion d'honneur, and he was killed in action on the 4th of November 1918, 1 week before the armistice. I am sure that this gallant officer would have loved to live and to serve his country, had he not lost his life as a result of the orders of politicians. The same could be said of the many thousands not mentioned by the Times. I spoke with the British prisoners of war who had just been brought to us. Officers and men alike openly declared that they were utterly fed up with the war, exactly as we German soldiers were. Mind you, the German frontline troops still stood firm in spite of the reports in the newspapers, which still arrived regularly. These reports said that the southeastern front had collapsed, that the Bulgarians had deserted as allies, and that the Austrians had been called home by their newly formed government. The Italians claimed to have won a glorious victory at Vittorio Veneto against the Austrian forces, which were practically non-existent. Those few who remained simply stuck their rifles into the ground, bayonet first, and flatly refused to fight. The frontline soldiers saw the so-called reserves arrive, boys who could hardly hold a rifle, men who had been taken out from the rear echelons behind the lines, but were too soft to endure the rigours of the open battlefield. Soldiers with unhealed wounds were sent back to the front. Still, they resisted an enemy who had fresh reserves and an abundance of food and ammunition. New trenches were dug and occupied, machine gun nests manned, and obstacle after obstacle erected. Then the Royal Flying Corps dropped millions more leaflets proclaiming that neither the British nor the French wanted to kill the soldiers who were doing the fighting. Their objective was the leaders who had brought about the disaster and who had lied for their own gain. The leaflets implored the soldiers to throw down their weapons, to surrender, and to join a nobler, freer society where all men were brothers. The German newspapers, on the other hand, printed headlines in large letters of the words of Sir Eric Geddes, First Lord of the Admiralty, that the British would squeeze Germany like a lemon until the pips squeak. Many British and German lives were lost on account of this stupid lemon squeezer. From behind the lines came exhortations to the frontline soldiers to heed the siren voices with their alluring promise that all men were brothers and that they would be received with open arms. We had heard all this before. "Revenge!" cried the voices. "Revenge on the war profiteers!" They had planned this war at their sumptuous banqueting tables and stolen the bread from the mouths of the soldiers and their families, leaving them to rot away in squalor and dirt so as to be undisturbed at their own lavish festivals. These voices shouted at the soldiers to tear the epaulets from the shoulders of their officers who had mistreated them for far too long, to kill them and to return to a new Germany. A state of peace, welfare and love would be created. Their banner should be a flag, red with the blood of their fallen comrades. On all street corners one could find the prophets of this faith, with red cockades in their caps and red flags in their hands. Many of them were former ammunition workers who had gone on strike and been put into uniform and drafted into the army. The front-line fighters were not very enthusiastic about this kind of talk and beat up the agitators. However, more and more Red Guardists arrived and tried to set up Soviets of soldiers. A supply column passed through our little township with red flags on their carts. A few seconds later, a platoon of infantrymen seized the drivers, gave them a good hiding and tore down the flags. In our field hospital on the 6th of November, we found ourselves virtually between the two front lines. Our chief had orders to pack up and march back into Belgium, but we still had quite a number of patients with broken limbs or pneumonia, for whom he had ordered ambulances to take them behind the lines. We waited and waited, but no ambulances arrived. Here again the pangy carts came in handy. We packed 3 or 4 patients at a time on top of these maids-of-all-work, or we improvised stretchers which we fastened to our horses. All our animals were used to pull the heavy wagons or to carry the patients, so we had to walk and to push the heavily laden carts when it became necessary. At a railhead we found an ambulance train under steam, ready to depart for Germany. We packed our patients onto this godsend and marched on. After 4 days we arrived at the small Belgian town of Halle. A civilian told us of the outbreak of a revolution in Germany, and also that the Kaiser had abdicated and fled to Holland. We did not believe a word of this at first, but a day later an army bulletin announced that an armistice had been concluded. According to this, the German army had to hand over all its heavy artillery and to evacuate the left bank of the Rhine. Cries went up from London and Paris to hang the Kaiser. It was Horatio Bottomley, a rather dubious John Bull character, who convinced the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, to adopt this slogan. There would have been a nasty shock had he and the French Premier, Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger, tried to carry out these threats. Many German divisions consisting of experienced NCOs and the best of the fighting men would have fought to the last man rather than deliver the Kaiser to the enemy, and so many more French and British would have died for this crazy idea. However, even Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg misjudged the high morale of the frontline troops when they persuaded the reluctant Kaiser to leave for Holland. Little Willie, the Crown Prince, volunteered to stand in for his father at any trial, but in the end the Dutch flatly refused to hand Wilhelm over to the Allies, so the whole scheme came to naught. Nonetheless, this all helped Lloyd George to achieve his goal of winning the khaki election of December 1918. Soon afterwards, most people in Britain realised that his election platform had been bloodthirsty and absurd, whipping up emotions caused by post-war hysteria. The new socialist regime in Germany did nothing to stop this anti-Wilhelm campaign. On the contrary, it suited them nicely to discredit the monarchy. The German armies now began an orderly retreat under the command of Hindenburg. They marched for 12 hours and rested for 12 hours. As the roads were used night and day, they were not congested. Our way led us via Liège over hilly country, and when the tired and emaciated horses were unable to pull the wagons uphill, we all had to push. Sometimes lorries would drag 2 or 3 carts at a time on long steel ropes running over large cogwheels installed on the hilltops. As for me, I marched in French army boots which my Batman had picked up somewhere. He sold them to me as they were not his size, and they fitted perfectly, indeed much better than my worn-out German riding boots with holes in the soles. By now, the hitherto uninterrupted deliveries of mail and newspapers had become rather erratic, leading to all kinds of rumours. We heard that the men of the German fleet had refused to sail their ships from Kiel, that they had mutinied and hoisted the red flag. Soldiers' councils were formed everywhere under the direct orders of the new leftist government. Even our small formation organised a Soviet, and the drivers and stretcher-bearers came to me, the Benjamin of the medical officers, asking me to be their chairman. I had other plans, namely to reach Berlin as soon as possible and to sit my final medical examinations. So regretfully, I declined this honour, and the next youngest doctor was appointed. The functions of these councils were very vague. Officially, they had to approve the orders given by the commanding officer of a formation, but in practice they confined themselves to supervising the distribution of rations and to stamping documents. Nothing in Germany was recognized as valid without at least one stamp and several illegible signatures, whether it concerned the posting of a soldier or an application for grease for wagon wheels. Whilst we marched east, masses of British, French and other Allied prisoners of war marched west. As we passed, a general handshaking took place between us, and once again I would emphasize there was no hatred. That was only created artificially by armchair warriors and mischief-making politicians. We crossed the Belgo-German frontier near Aachen, and the local population were almost frantic in their greetings. The frontline soldiers did not have much sympathy for the new regime under Ebert and Scheidemann, not knowing that the proclamation of a German Social Democratic Republic had only just staved off an attempt by the communist Spartacists, a movement which took its name from the leader of the slave uprising in ancient Rome, to seize power and impose their brand of socialism on Germany. The infantrymen and the artillery gunners tore down the red flags and beat up their bearers. In an industrial town, a well-known hotbed of deep red socialism, they demolished a large triumphal arch bearing the inscription, "Welcome to the German Socialist Republic." Sirens called the workers out from the factories, and a tense situation developed when the workers attempted to attack the commanding officer of a field artillery formation, which was just passing through the town. Without having received any orders from their officers, the soldiers made their weapons ready to fire on the masses. It needed only one spark to ignite a massacre. The mayor rushed to the scene, and he and a number of officers managed to calm the crowds. The workers returned to their factories and the soldiers marched on, but I do not know whether the triumphal arch was re-erected. Some of our men lived in these parts of Western Germany, and they disappeared without permission from our commanding officer, or even that of the Soldiers' Council. On and on we marched, never less than 12 hours per day. Now a new duty was assigned to me, namely that of liaison officer with the medical units and Army HQ. My job was to keep them in contact with higher command, and to see to it that orders reached the field hospitals, companies of stretcher-bearers and casualty clearing stations. This was not easy with the inefficient telephone communication system and with units which were almost constantly on the move. So a motor ambulance was allocated to me, but it broke down almost in sight of the Rhine. Therefore I had to cross the river on foot over a pontoon bridge with my belongings on my shoulder, just as I had done in August 1914 in the first days of the war. I waited for my formation, which arrived towards nightfall. I was now given a horse to ride, and was always in the vanguard so as to prepare night quarters for the tired troops. Often I had to arrange for entire houses to be cleared out and straw to be laid in the rooms, in order to squeeze 25 to 30 exhausted men into them. Under the command of Divisional HQ, assembly areas had been created, and our destination was an agricultural community in one of the most fertile parts of Westphalia near Munster. There was no lack of food here. The local farmers had grown rich on the black market, and they killed pigs for us. Their wives baked bread and cakes, and we lived like lords on the fat of the land. We certainly ate more in 1 week than we had done during the whole of the last few months. We were waiting for orders as to where to demobilize, and I knew that the latest date for adding my name to the list of final examination students was the 10th of December 1918. In the meantime, more men absconded, some even taking their horses with them. We suspected that they sold them to the local farmers for their fares home. As we had no advice from Divisional HQ about plans for our demobilization, the chief went to Munster to make inquiries because he was anxious to return to his own medical practice in Magdeburg. He could only report that perhaps in several weeks' time we would be transported to Silesia and only then be allowed to return to Civvy Street. This would have shattered my own plans, and so I persuaded him to let me go to Munster to see what I could do. My Batman and I rode there on horseback, and I told the Chief of Staff that our precious and dangerous drugs were being stolen, and that there was a danger that they might find their way into the hands of drug peddlers. Apparently this made a deep impression on him. Finally, the divisional commander agreed to let us hand over our stuff to the Medical Corps depot in Munster and immediately demobilize the officers and other ranks of the field hospital. With this order in my pocket, I rode back to our chief and got him to write out my certificate of demobilization, without which I could not have travelled, and worse still, would not have been able to apply for a food ration book. The whole document was merely a piece of paper torn out of an army notebook, but signed and properly stamped in good Prussian style. Now I had to go to the chairman of the Soldatenrat, the Soldiers' Council, for him to add his signature and stamp. It was a little strange to see two official stamps on the same piece of paper, one with the crowned eagle inscribed Royal Prussian Field Hospital No. 380, and the other Soldiers' Council of Field Hospital No. 380 of the Socialist Republic of Germany. In the left-hand corner was a large grease spot. I sent a telegram to my mother announcing my return to Berlin. At 6 a.m. my Batman drove me to the nearest railway station at New Beckham, and here I squeezed into a train full to overflowing with soldiers. The only seat I could find was only temporarily unoccupied in the lavatory. I talked to many officers and men on the endless journey, and almost all of them longed to start the new life of which they had dreamt in the trenches. One spoke of his old father who had kept the farm going. Others talked about their wives, whom they had not seen for years, and of the changes that might await them when they arrived home. There were also students like myself, eager to complete their studies and to start their careers. For others, the life of an ordinary civilian no longer appealed, and they became the nucleus of the Freikorps, which was recruited by the Baltic barons to drive the Red Hordes from their estates. They would be kept by their masters like medieval mercenaries, until finally they became the forerunners of the Nazis and their brown-shirted rabble. The train reached Berlin late at night, and I dragged out my heavy trunk. Here I was on the station platform which bore the name of my hometown. This was the moment for which I had yearned for so many years. First, I had to show my certificate of demobilization to a sergeant with a red armlet and a red rosette on his cap. He affixed yet another stamp on this piece of paper. Then I came to the barrier and had to give up my ticket. A notice hung there saying that officers were not allowed to carry arms, and I had a dagger-like knife on my belt, which belonged to a medical officer's uniform for personal protection. I found it useful on one occasion when I was attacked by a Senegalese soldier, to whom I was trying to give an anti-tetanus injection. The knife had served me well for 4 years. I had also used it to cut the trousers away from soldiers wounded in the legs, or to open tins of bully beef when I had no tin opener. Under the notice on the railway platform stood a sentry. A mere schoolboy, he wore a red armlet and had a cigarette in his mouth, a rifle dangling upside down from his shoulder, and an obsolete pickelhaube on his head. He looked at me and my dagger, and I looked at him and his rifle, waiting to see what his next move would be. In the end, he grew red in the face and did not utter a sound, hash and better for him and for me. Then there was my mother. She had already been waiting for hours and was almost frozen stiff. She had brought with her a little four-wheeled cart on which I put my trunk. Both of us pulled it through the dark side streets. This was to avoid the main roads because, my mother explained, of the firefights between the socialists and the Spartacists. So I returned to my parents' home almost 5 years after I had left it to put on the Königsrock, the uniform of the Kaiser's army. My old civilian clothes had disappeared, and it was impossible to buy new ones, so I had to wear the uniform for quite some time longer. If I had hoped that my return home to Berlin was journey's end, I soon found out that I was mistaken. The following morning was the last for registration for the final medical examinations. As I walked towards the Ministry of Education on Unter den Linden, I came under fire from rebel sailors who had come to Berlin from Kiel. They had barricaded themselves in the Imperial Mews and Armory, and were besieged by troops loyal to the Kaiser, who were bombarding them with artillery and trench mortars. Just as when I was an infantryman, it was a case of taking cover immediately. When I did reach the university with my papers, the place was in utter chaos. What was left of the windows was filled with sandbags, and bullets were ricocheting off the walls. I had to go to the Studentenrat, the Students' Council, to get permission to sit the examinations. I found them in solemn conclave deep in the basement, in the anteroom of the ladies' lavatory. There were hardly any reliable newspapers, and certainly no radio. Rumours were rife that the Spartacists had killed 50 or more policemen. We felt that the shaky socialist government was on the brink of complete breakdown. It had in no way fulfilled our hopes and wishes. The dictatorship of the proletariat would soon be established, bringing more chaos and bloodshed in its wake. From reliable eyewitness accounts of German soldiers who had returned from Russian prisoner-of-war camps, we knew about the dreadful conditions there. Posters appealed to former frontline soldiers to come forward and form a kind of security police force to prevent further murders and civil disorder. I volunteered to join the 8th Hussars. My orders were to keep my steel helmet and uniform at the ready and to report to local headquarters when called. I kept a cavalry carbine in my cupboard at home, together with a belt of 50 rounds of ammunition and several hand grenades. These looked rather different from the harmless firecrackers which we had let off on New Year's Eve of 1913. I am convinced that such units prevented communism from taking over Germany. Without them, the red flag with its hammer and sickle would now be flying on the shores of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. On this New Year's Eve, there was no family party. Members of my family were scattered across Europe, dead. The same applied to the families of our friends. Many of the younger ones had been killed, some were in hospital, and others were still prisoners of war in France, Britain, or Russia. It was forbidden to bring Christmas trees into Berlin. People had very few candles to light, no fuel to keep warm, and the power stations were idle as the workers preferred to march with the Spartacists. Almost 5 years had vanished since I had put on the Kaiser's uniform in Freiburg. Nearly all my pals lay buried in foreign soil, together with 9 million soldiers who had lost their lives in the Great War. And for what?